Just making sure everyone can hear me okay up the back. I'm not eating the mic or anything. Good. And I'm just going to get used to dual wielding this. Thanks for coming. Thanks for spending money and taking the time to be here instead of anywhere else. That is very nice of you. This is my talk, a framework for designing metagame systems. I'm Jack Sinclair. Just a quick acknowledgement of country. So I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land which we meet today, Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay our respects to elders past and present. Never got to do that before, so that's cool. Cool, so I'm Jack, that's me. I've been a game designer for about 8 years, give or take. I've worked at EA for 5 years, Two Balls for about a year, did some consulting for a group called Narvik, and now I'm at PlaySide very recently. So there's been a spectrum of work, like EA, live service, mobile sort of thing, also did prototyping on some like casual puzzle stuff. Two Balls is like a big something, that's a whole story, but yeah, big scale project. Narvik is interesting, that was consulting with clients of all sorts of, so I consulted for Epic, a bunch of startups on a whole range of products. Also did a lot of market research, game deconstructions for clients and things like that. So yeah, I think I'm bringing like a whole bunch of stuff from my array of experiences into metagame systems design, but like systems design in general, I think. I was sort of not sure what to call this talk. It's called something else out there. Obviously, I was thinking about calling it meta layers, but I thought that was a bit wanky. I don't want to invent new terms on my first GCAP talk in person. So why am I giving this talk? 4 things. I've been in a lead senior role for a little while now, and I've worked with clients who either don't know much about game design and like the ins and outs, and so when you need to like explain something very simple, you really need to articulate it. So the first thing is process. At a basic level, we're trying to either create new systems or we're trying to analyze existing systems, right? Using this framework that I propose as part of this talk. The second thing is vocabulary. Talking about design is really, really hard, and some people like to get up and propose new terms and make things even more complicated than they need to be. But I think the real thing that we get from having a shared vocabulary is that as a team, I'm really talking about development, is that we have a shared vocabulary to articulate problems and articulate solutions, and that's like the biggest thing. I think we've all been in that situation where we spend ages trying to like describe the thing, this thing that we're trying to do and the thing, and then we all end up coming to like one word, and wouldn't it be good if we just had a word at the start that we got off some talk? So yeah, and saving time. Having a shared vocabulary saves a lot of time, in my experience. The other thing is intent. As a reviewer or as a lead, someone who's looking at your work, help me understand what it is specifically that you are trying to achieve. So sure, you've gone with this system or this design or this feature, but why that one? Why that one among all the other ones? What is about this one that will work? And that sort of feeds into accountability. This isn't like, you need to be accountable. It's like, you know, when things go right or when things go wrong, it's like we can look back on the system and these things that I suggest in the framework and say, well, this was meant to do that, and did it or didn't it? And then let's like talk about that and let's analyze that. So those are the 4 things. I think I should clarify what I mean by metagame. Designers or developers kind of mean something quite different compared to players, which is a whole other talk. So simple examples, we've got Mario, stomp Goombas, complete levels, and run around, collect coins, and then you've got, you know, the map. This is like a really simple progression, right? Super linear, a little bit of branching, nothing crazy. And this is mostly an arc, right? There's nothing really happening in the metagame that's feeding back into the core gameplay. Arguably there's a little bit, depends on the Mario game, I'm just sort of broadly speaking here, but for the most part it's an arc, which is fine, by the way, not everything has to be a loop. Clash Royale, spoilers. Clash Royale is completely different gameplay. Lay down units, they march forward, destroy each other's towers, and then the metagame is like much more complex compared to Super Mario World or whatever it was. You're unlocking new cards, you're powering up those cards, you're getting resources so that you can pay the upfront cost, you're leveling up, you're getting the resources, and these feed into each other. So this is more of a compulsion loop. The core gameplay is unlocking things in the metagame that feed straight back into the core gameplay. Compulsion loop. And then something I've been playing recently, Jedi Survivor, right? Kind of like Mario. Kill baddies, get to the end, whatever, move on, next story checkpoint. but you've got like, ability upgrades where this sort of like feeds back into core gameplay. I can use 2 lightsabers, I can throw them, I can throw 2, I can do that, and it's a bit more powerful. This idea of like vertical progression and horizontal progression. Sometimes numbers go up, sometimes I get more things in my toolkit. It's 2 different types of progression. But they've also got like shops, right? If I go to this planet, I get this resource, and if I collect enough, I can buy perks, more perk slots or different perks or whatever it is. But I've also got a garden, and I can collect seeds, and now I can plant in my garden, and I've got a big garden, and that's got its own progression. I've also got an aquarium. I'm finding fish, and I'm putting them in my aquarium, and I can like make it clean. And there's a lot going on, right? Some of these things feed into each other, some things don't, and this is a type of metagame approach. I guess you can kind of go broad appeal, right? I think it all ties in a similar way, but anyway, that's metagame. It's progression, it's meta layers, it's a whole bunch of things. It's not the most optimal strategy in League of Legends, at least from a design perspective and development. So, the framework. We've got 3 things. We have motivations, we have goals, we have narrative framing. You might have heard some of these before. We're going to break them down as part of this talk. And so let's get started with, a quick definition. So motivations, understanding what the player finds fulfilling, right? So like the reason one person plays a game compared to another might be completely different. Or people who play this one game in particular might have a shared motivation. Me, for instance, I love cleaning. What is it about cleaning I find so satisfying? I don't know, but it feels good. And I want the game, in this hypothetical game, to fulfill that motivation, right? I want it to scratch that itch. Goals, communicating tangible actions towards completing those, fulfilling those motivations, right? I want to clean, I want to do it so bad. Game, how do I do that? What's going to let me scratch that itch? Sorry. Also, providing rewards. So the important thing about goals is that, great, now we know how to, like, what I can do to fulfill my motivation, and now we need to reinforce to the player that they are doing it. It is happening, right? Sometimes this is obvious, sometimes that's not the case. That's why we use rewards or milestones, achievements, checkpoints to sort of be like, it's happening, you're doing it, you're working towards it, it's going to be so clean, it's going to be great. The last thing is narrative framing. This one's a bit more nebulous, and it really depends on the game, and we'll obviously dive into it, but this is really just, I like to think of this as helping the player make sense of it all, right? We have a system, it's a bunch of moving parts. Now, what can we, what's the skin on top of that people can go, great, well, I know how that works in the real world, so I can make a whole bunch of assumptions about how the system works, and now we don't have to onboard them with as much information. We'll get into it. So, starting off, motivations. How do we use motivations, or how have I used it? I should pretext to this. These are a bunch of design tools to use in your practice, right? These are things that have helped me in my practice or my craft. These are things that have helped me communicate design to various clients, stakeholders, fellow designers and peers, people who are not of the design discipline. It's up to you. I hope this is helpful. If it's not, that sucks. But hopefully there are things in here that you can pull from it. Maybe it's all of it. Maybe it's like a little bit of it. When I have had specific design problems, when I go online and I look at GDC talks or online talks, like I found I'll take like one little thing and I'll put that in my bucket of tools, right? So, I take what you will, apply the whole framework if that helps. I didn't want to make an acronym. Calling it the MGN framework seemed like, whoa, who's this guy? Like, whole new framework, came up with an acronym, but you can call it that if you like. Anyway, moving on. How to use motivations. So, build a system from one or more motivations, right? So if we're starting from scratch, or analyze a system through its motivations, right? So, game design, I think it's like cooking. We are boiling down the components of our system, or our metagame, or our feature really, and we're, into its little individual parts, and we're thinking about what goes well together, what traditionally goes well together, or at least understanding what doesn't traditionally, but could. It's just good to understand the principles of, good design, and then once we understand that, we can start to subvert, play around with like weird motivations. That doesn't typically go with that, but what if it did? That'd be weird, right? Anyway, it's kind of up to you. There's no right or wrong thing you can do in cooking, so long as it tastes good, so long as it's fun, right? So there's a great talk. We're talking about motivations. We need to talk about intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, sort of some assumed knowledge here. But Matt Woodward at the time was the economy designer for Albion Online, and if you played that game, whoa, economy design. He talks about in his talk, intrinsic motivation is the blue circle on the left. It's the things that players will enjoy. And the extrinsic motivation or rewards, these are the things the player will actually do, right? I can attest to this. Worked on a game called Real Racing 3. There's a race in it called, there's a track called Le Mans, if you've heard. It's a really long track, and there's 10 laps of it. And somehow it got broken, and there's way too many rewards, and now it's like easily the most optimal way to grind the soft currency in the game, right? So what do players do? They just do it. Do it again and again and again. And they hate it. They hate it so much. It's so boring, but they do it because it's the most efficient thing to do. If I do any other race now, that's a terrible idea. You could easily be getting more like soft currency per second if you do 10 laps of Le Mans. And if you do, that's like the longest race. So anyway, that's something to keep in mind as we move on. So let's look at some motivations, intrinsic motivations. We'll talk about extrinsic, like rewards and that sort of thing, but we're really just focusing on intrinsic motivations for this part. So these are some resources. I've got some at the end. These are the first ones. So there's a great one by Quantic Foundry. They did a lot more qualitative research, a lot of surveys. They did like a sort of, it was like tricky. They did like a Myers-Briggs type profile. It's like, find out what sort of gamer you are. That was all a trick. They just wanted your data, and they wanted to be able to like collect it into these like groups of players. And again, there's something here that I don't agree, like action destruction. Like there are people who just like blowing stuff up and will just do that all day and night. Like it seems kind of specific. Like mine was cleaning. I get that. It can be specific. But some of these are broader and more helpful, and it really depends on what resonates with you, right? So like you pick some out, you use them to sort of drive the why of your system. And there's like high categories and like subcategories and this sort of thing. Another is Game Refinery. This is more mobile oriented. They say it applies to all games, but they surveyed mobile players, so take for that what you will. And you can see there's a lot of overlap. We've got like mastery. We've got like management is a bit more mobile-y, social exploration, things like that. And the last one, this one's really good. 5 Domains of Play by Jason Vanderberg. Creative director at Ubisoft at the time of 2012, worked on some cool games like Far Cry 3, love that. And he sort of identifies or realizes and boils it down to his talk that there's this thing in human psychology called the Big Five. And he realizes, it occurs to him that this actually maps really well to games, because games are psychology kind of thing. And he reframes it as a game design thing. These are like 5 high-level motivations, and he breaks it down to like 30 sub-motivations, right? And if you map your game along these 30 sub-motivations, you can like get a player who does the profile and be like, you're gonna like these games. Now, that's great. That's really, really cool. As a game designer, I don't have time for that, right? To like sit and like map our game to like every single motivation and be like, this works, blah, 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 blah. And this is kind of where like my thing comes in, right? I came up with this in like 2 minutes. The exact contents don't specifically matter, but the way that I use motivations in my practice is to pick a few that I'm really trying to achieve, right, with my system. So my system might be about collection. I'm adding a collection system. The core motivation behind that is collection. We start to think about what does that mean? Let's unpack collection. It's about displaying it. It's about like, there's something about like the pristine nature of the thing that I'm collecting, and I want to like put it on a shelf, and I don't want to touch it, and I want everyone to see it, right? You can really frame it like that. Or mastery. We had this thing on a merge game I worked on. It's like skill didn't feel quite right. If you've played like a merge game, you just like tap the thing and the things come out and then you merge them. That's so easy, right? But like if I understand all the rules and stuff like that felt more like mastery than like a mechanical skill compared to like Rocket League. And so these things are really nebulous, right? Like again, it's what resonates with you. Again, like narrative, that's role-play fantasy. These things are broad, but the couple I want to acknowledge out of this list, though, is completion and achievement. So completion's kind of a funny one. There's, like, your game can be completed, probably, for the most part, unless it's like a live service thing that never ends, right? It will run out of content. And in that sense, this motivation of completion is sort of like inherently being fulfilled. You can do things to make that like nice for players if it's like a driving motivation of the game. It's about like clocking it, and you add like a whole bunch of systems and ways to track progress towards that goal. But like, I don't really worry about this one. That's just me. The other thing is achievement. This one is like this is a bit different. This is a constant. We are always trying to fulfill the core motivation of achievement. Everyone wants to be told they're doing a great job. Everyone wants that reinforcement that, hey, this is working, you're doing it, you're the best, you're getting points, you're getting rewards, woohoo, that's the best. So just calling that out. So when I think about motivations, I like to think about the things that typically go well together. Picking one motivation to like drive a system might be a little bit like too simple, right? I think like some good things start to happen, and when we get to player segments, we'll see some good things start to happen when we pair them. So like some really, and like these things might seem obvious, right? But I think we take for granted like why we put particular systems in games. And I've noticed a trend with like games at the moment where it's like, do you ever feel like you're playing a game that has progression for the sake of progression? Like the number just goes up so that it can go up and get to the higher number, and then it's like fantastic, right? I think we need to like think a little bit more deeply about why we have progression or why we have these systems. What motivations are these trying to fulfill? Great. So let's look at some examples. Skill and competition. This is not groundbreaking. These things typically go pretty well together. We'll look at an example. Collection and discovery. So with skill and competition, we have something like rank system. Wow, crazy, right? Rocket League has a huge like mechanical skill depth, right? Like that thing goes on forever. I wish I was better at it than I am. I suck and I try so hard and it never works, but that's fine. It's not why we're here. You know, but what's important about this is the way that they like frame it is that it's all about skill, and they really lean into the idea of like sport, because that is something that like you can attribute to skill already. That's more about narrative framing. There's also just this idea of competition. It's like, it's inherently, like ELO is inherently a PvP system. It works in the context of a game that's about competition. So using a rank system in a PvP game that you want to be about competition makes a whole lot of sense, because now players can compare themselves. I'm champion, Jeremy's supersonic legend. Screw Jeremy, I want to be a supersonic legend, right? Anyway, collection and discovery. Again, with Jedi Survivor. This one's great. It's like, if we come to this idea of discovery, this little fish guy, right? It tells you a long story if you sort of go off the beaten path, right? And it's like, oh, what's around, you know, what's around that corner? That thing that games do, and we all see it. It's like, go down there. Oh, it's that side path, right? That feels good. That's like discovery, or at least one definition of discovery, right? And so I go off the beaten path, and who do I find? This guy, he dives in and gets me a fish, and he puts it in the aquarium. And that aquarium is so important, right? That's the thing that's about collection. I now get to like see my fish, and the fish are a representation of my ability to fulfill my motivation of discovery, right? Like it's great. And also like even they have the, it's in the thing before, the fish tank gets like cleaner, right? It's just a way to basically be like, your shelf's getting better. Your shelf is so good and everybody loves it. These are just examples. So now we have motivations, right? And we can use motivations as a way to sort of like, again, build new systems or analyze our systems. We can start to frame some problems or come up with some questions. So we can ask things like, is this system successfully fulfilling the intended motivation? I intended for this to be about collection, but it's not really scratching that itch, right? This is like when it starts to become very specific about your problem out there in YouTube. Like, I don't know what you're working on. I don't really know what problems you're facing. But what I've found helps is if you, again, boil it down into that core motivation and then ask, is it fulfilling it? Or isn't it fulfilling it in a way that you feel is adequate? And that's a case-by-case basis. Is it trying to fulfill too many motivations? You've gone too broad, right? It needs to be about skill, collection, also mastery, also creative expression is too much. Like, you just need to boil it down to the things that really matter. I find maybe in life, but particularly in game design, choosing like a few things that you want to do really, really well and concentrating on that typically leads to better design. If you're going to go like super broad and we want to do everything, yeah, you could, but it's hard. It's hard. Make it easy, right? Use different systems, split it up, do something else. Also, is this even the motivation we had intended to fulfill? It was meant to be about like role-play fantasy, and now it's become like a weird status thing. Like, you know, players are now using these things that we really didn't intend to be about status, and now they're comparing it, and now they have it like they've hijacked it. And this isn't like a bad thing. You might be like, okay, cool, let's ride that. You know, let's make it more about that. Or like that's a problem, you know, and we need to like come back to these core motivations and be like, why is it fulfilling the wrong one, and what can we do to fix that? So this, like, when I was making this talk, it's like it was going to end there, and I feel like it's like, well, okay, like what do I do then? It's like, how do I actually identify these problems? And so this is a hard one because you've basically got two things. You've got data, right? And I've typically worked in like relatively sizable enough teams where we have data analysts. And I was thinking about like Melbourne abroad, it's like maybe we don't all have data analysts just on hand. Like, hey, Paul, can I just get some data? Thanks. Like that's like a privilege, right? Like we don't all have that. So the other thing is your brain, which is like, that sucks, that's not helpful. But even when you have a data analyst, it comes down to that. So you might have something that looks like this, right? You have like a Fatui, or you've had telemetry that's like, you know, at event 20 and that's on like day 3 or something like this. And we can identify these drop-off points, right? I can see like between like event 3 and 6, something's happening, right? People are just sort of dropping off. And then like between events 11 and 12, like there's something really bad. But Paul's not going to tell me why. Like, Paul's not going to be like, because unless you have like phenomenal telemetry, like I've never quite had that of like some sort of machine learning, I have no idea. Typically what's then needed to happen is that I as a designer now need to go into the game, I need to go to these steps, and I need to look at it and use my judgment and say, this is not working. Right? So even then, I think at the end of the day, you as a designer are the one who's going to have to work out what the solution, well, what the problem is in the first place, right? We know where the problem's happening, but we don't know what it is. And then also use your expertise and your craft to come to a solution. And maybe motivations are a way that helps that. But even better than motivations, right? We're instantly going off from the framework. Screw the framework. Even better than motivations are user personas and player types. This is when we start to like, so I think we make games for people, right? Like we make games for a lot of times ourselves. And I think if we can break away from that and make it for someone and get as excited for making a game for someone else and not us, that's really, really good. That's a good thing to get used to. We can take motivations and we can turn them into user personas or player types. So this is an example, Bartle's player types. It's like a classic. I don't really like it. This idea that like you've just got a cohort of killers in your game or something. It was made during the time of MUDs, like multi-user dungeons, so it's inherently extremely social. And so just keep that in mind when applying it to your game. Is your game super social? Maybe not. Another one, obviously like the people at Quantic Foundry, they've taken their motivations and they've built it, they've turned them into player segments. So we can start to see here, you know, challenge discovery is the acrobat, right? And they've got a motto and they've got like a bunch of games that they like to play. And you could make this a user persona. The acrobat could be called Andy. Andy the acrobat. And Andy likes these games and really cares about these motivations and these sorts of things. And what I love about this is that this is like a hell of a way to rally a team, right? As a designer, our job is really to communicate a lot of the time. We've got a great idea. We love it. We have confidence in it. We've gone away. We've looked at our motivations. We've used the MGN framework. We've used the DDE. We've used all these things. We loved it in this game. And so now we have to like actually get people on board with that. So if we can boil that down into, it's not super helpful for me to go around saying like, oh, like if you look at this framework and look at these motivations, if we just go like, let me introduce you to Andy. This is what Andy likes, right? And this is who we're making it for. And we can all get hyped about making the game for Andy. I think that's just a powerful tool. That's a powerful tool. In my experience as a designer, it gets a bit producery. It's about like, you know, rallying the troops and getting everyone excited and like hyping people up. And that's worked pretty well. Yeah, the next thing really, this is like, so if player segments and user personas are like Myers-Briggs, this is like psychology. This is like going to your player and sitting them down on like, you know, the Chase Lounge and being like, tell me everything. So when I worked on The Sims Mobile, we collaborated a lot with the Sims 4 team, Maxis, because they made the game initially and they handed it over to us, and we were doing a lot of like, you know, synergy stuff with their Sims 4 packs. And I think they'd done a breakdown of like who is a Sims 4 player versus like a Sims Mobile player. And like, my God, like the nuances of a Sims 4 player and what they care about is like so much more specific than you can possibly imagine. And it's awesome. Like as a designer, that guidance for like, you know, solving problems, influencing like my design decisions and why I go one way and not another. If I have like all that data around a player and I have so much ammo to say like, this is the right direction because look at all this stuff that they care about. They don't care about that. They do care about this. That's why we should go this way. Instead, you're kind of like floundering. I think that's kind of the helpful thing about motivations though. It's like a simple version of it that we can apply to our practice in terms of just saying, well, let's go this way instead of that way, right? And that's super powerful. It is like the worst feeling when you have that design paralysis and you've got an idea and you're like, it's an idea, but I have absolutely no way to assess if it's the right idea or if it's a good idea. So it's just helpful to get out of that. So let's look at a motivations breakdown. Let's break it down, a system into its motivations using the lovely Animal Crossing. I'm going to have to speed it up a bit. So the progression of Animal Crossing over the years I found to be fascinating because the core game has not actually changed that much, right? The core motivations. Typically, you have a large space, whether it be an island or a small town, and you are like cleaning it up and making it really pretty, right? Or your house on it really pretty, and you're making sure there are more people there. And the new game is mostly like that, right? That's like pretty much what happens in New Horizons. But there's so much more going on in New Horizons in terms of like metagame systems, right? And that structure that they brought to that core fantasy, that core experience, is super interesting to look at. So let's look at a system that has like pretty much always been part of Animal Crossing. We've got the museum, right? If you don't know Blathers, you find like it's an empty museum, which is like a sin, an empty museum. That goes against everything I know about museums, but I already know what museums are, right? Narrative framing. So I get, fossils and bugs, and I fill it up, and I get to see that as part of my collection. So you have a simple action. If I collect a new bug, I'll fulfill the goal of completing my collection, right? My motivation is collection. And this is really delivered on, right? As I fill my museum, I get to like wander around it with my friends. I get to like admire the sharks and swimming. I get to read information about them. That's collection. In the first Animal Crossing game, you didn't have a museum. You just had some guy who like emailed you and said, "That's a sick fossil. Nice." That's it. That's not collection. That's nothing. That's just like, I don't know, again, just like basic progression. I don't know what motivation that's trying to fulfill. Really ends up just being discovery, which is still part of it. I'm motivated to like experiment and try new things, come at different times of day, look in different like nooks and crannies, try new tools, just experiment and try new things and see what works and see what new butterflies and fossils I can collect. So we can look at this, right, this initial thing, and we can now add this. We can look at it and break it down into its motivations, and then we might try to, say somehow with Animal Crossing we had just started here, this is where we're up to, we've made the museum, maybe let's double down on these. What other ways can we fulfill this? Or maybe we feel like these have been like fulfilled and now we want to try new motivations. It doesn't particularly matter where you go from here. The point is that you have like this common understanding with which we can point it and say, yeah, it's about discovery, it's about collection, and are we delivering on those motivations? The next one is tasks. Tasks, so easy. Wrong. Tasks are not easy. Again, if you come back to intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, the danger you have of rewarding players for doing things that they don't care about, that's dangerous. That's super dangerous. So in Animal Crossing, it's pretty broad, and they've had like years of experience or like games that have come out to sort of identify what things are enjoyable at Animal Crossing and what things you should reward. And so again, as an example, we've got, if we come back to just collecting resources, so bugs, fish, and things like that, if you complete tasks, you get Nook Miles, right? You get like 10, 100, 1,000, or whatever. And eventually those Nook Miles feed into items, and items are really what I care about as a reward because, these fulfills different goals, like making my island great and like pretty, or building a house, also making it pretty, or customizing my avatar. And this also feeds into the idea of like role play and fantasy. It's about creativity and trying new things and seeing what looks good, but also, I want it to be like a coffee island and it's all one big cafe, or I want it to be a slum, or I want it to be Japanese, or whatever, right? You get to role play as whatever you'd like and fulfill this fantasy of like building a resort island in a particular theme. So that caps off motivations. So motivation takeaways, satisfying their intrinsic motivations are the real reasons players are playing your game. And so if we can find that out, we can work out what that is, that's huge, right? We have ammo with which to make important design decisions. Map your reward systems to intrinsic motivations, so make sure you know what your players like doing or what they find motivating, and then reward that. Don't reward grindy stuff that they don't actually like doing. And use motivations to articulate design decisions. You've got to convince another designer, your producer, a stakeholder why you're going with that and the other. Why, they ask you. Because it's cool. Because it's great. No, that's not really going to work, right? Unless you're like really good at that, it's going to be sick, and they're like, oh, cool. No, you like motivations, right? We have like actual design process. Cool, goals. So we won't touch on goals for too long. Hopefully you're somewhat familiar. Short, medium, long-term goals, not groundbreaking. We've got short-term goals, so this is typically the end of your like core gameplay loop, or it's like an early step in the system. We've got long-term goals, which are ultimately the realizations of these motivations in a lot of cases, right? So if my motivation is status, it's about becoming the most known, right, or the most famous. Skill is about being the best, the most skilled, and collect them all. And something I've found, and maybe it's just me, but like medium-term goals are sort of this like weird middle ground. It's either like a smaller version of the long-term goal or a bigger version of the short-term goal. And so yeah, it's just this weird no man's land, do this now, work towards this. But without it, we have this slog, right? It's just like, kind of like the museum, as we'll get to. It's like, okay, do this action. And very eventually, over time, the more you do it, you will fulfill that core motivation. That's a long time. It's going to take, it depends, also, this depends on the scale of your game. If you're getting a 4-hour experience, this is maybe not so applicable. I'm sort of coming at it from, bigger games, as it were. So where we can use medium-term goals is to scaffold that. We can add like a checkpoint, a reward, and make them like, you feel rewarded. Like it's not just that I'm slowly slogging away at my long-term motivation. Things are happening between that are sort of reaffirming my progress or making me feel good about my progress towards that long-term goal. So if we come back to the idea of rank in Rocket League, without a medium-term goal, it would look like this. Win matches of car soccer, and eventually, you'll be the best. You'll be awesome at it. It's going to be so good. And then, so imagine if we didn't have rank. It'd be like just some great big leaderboard where it's like, I want to become 500,000th and eventually 32,000th, and that's not meaningful. I can't make goals off that, right? Just becoming like, and I'm certainly not going to try to be number one. Well, some people will, but they're wrong. You never will. It's hard. This is not a good way to frame goals or like progression. And if it was just, this might seem obvious. I've worked with clients where it's like, why not just one big giant leaderboard, right? It seems obvious, but then when someone asks you why not, and it's like, oh, geez, that's a good question. Maybe that's why I'm making this talk. So what do? We have ranks. My short and long-term goals stay exactly the same. It's about winning matches of car soccer and reaching the top rank, or whatever top means to you. For me, it's like I want to become, what's the one after Diamond? I can't remember. I want to become like Diamond 3. God, it would be good to be Diamond 3. Champion. Whoa. So the medium-term goal is to rank up. We add a milestone to that. In the leaderboard example, you could just say it's like getting one ahead, but that's obviously not going to work because there's so many players and it's constantly changing. We need like these milestone moments towards the long-term goal. And so now we have rank. I want to become Diamond 3 and maybe eventually Grand Champion. And every time I rank up, I make like a meaningful step of progress towards that long-term reward. And so with the museum, like I said, catching a bug, completing my museum, takes a long time. And that's how it felt in the old games, in my opinion. And so with the task system, this one's a bit funny because it's not actually necessarily like a way of breaking down this long-term goal in the same way that rank is doing, but we're sort of creating like an adjacent system with which to say, like, if we think of this as a timeline of experience for the player, in the middle now, I have still like a milestone reward moment. It's towards a different long-term goal, but at least they still feel rewarded, right? But we can be, actually, just a quick thing. I use this for a client. It's like, let's take it as this example. I start, there's a whole bunch of effort and there's a payoff. And maybe this is too long. And so we break it up, right? It's a chest. It's like 3 keys. Every single time we get a key, it's like, wahoo, you got a key. That's awesome. You're doing the best. And now eventually you unlock the chest and you get the same reward. It's the same thing, right? We're just breaking it down to be they feel that progression towards that long-term goal or that reward or whatever. I guess this doesn't apply particularly to, I could apply to a lot of things. But let's be braver than that. Let's fix Animal Crossing. It's already perfect. No, it's not. Catching a bug, completing my museum, that takes too long. We could have museum ratings. We could break it down, right? We could have it so that like instead Blathers isn't just like, now the museum is full, right? We could like break it down so it's like a museum has a rating, and maybe it's not as granular as like every new one item. It's like if you get a set, if I finish a dinosaur, I get points, right? So we could break it down however we want. And what I find interesting is that they've done this, right? They actually did this with a bunch of systems in New Horizons. So now you had like a star rating because this long-term goal of making an island great for people like myself is like super nebulous, right? I'd sort of prefer if you just gave me a star rating and I can go, cool, 4 out of 5, 5 out of 5. I did it. I know what that means. They also do it with houses. They've got like some crazy feng shui system where it's like, you've got to rank house S, right? So the core motivation here originally might have been like creative expression. And now I don't know what it is specifically, but we're supplementing it for something a little bit more tangible, right? Something that people can go, oh, good, I am making progress towards like this long-term goal of having a great house. For players who are more like creatively minded, they're maybe more able to frame that in a way that makes sense for them. But for people who myself who are not artists, I'm like, I don't know, it looks good. What do you want from me, right? But none of this really matters if we're not communicating goals to the player. So we need to remind them, that how to complete these various goals, right? It's about creating tangible actions. So we need to communicate that. We need to let them know that they can complete these various goals. Like, it wouldn't be super helpful in Animal Crossing if the museum was something like a button in the UI and it was sort of nested and I never really tapped on it and then I just sort of forgot it was there and then I just bounce off it as a player. Even though as a player, I might actually have found that system really compelling, right? Really satisfying, but if I don't know about it, it's not going to happen. And that they are completing those various goals. So this comes down to feedback. This is like maybe like a light UX thing. So Animal Crossing, they're very good at it. They notify you every single time you finish a task, and it's like a nice little cute ring, just, hey, you completed a task, no big deal, come back when you're ready. They do it with the mailbox, and also they do it with Fatui. So they introduce these systems. And I love this screenshot, right? Like, this is the coolest thing, because in this sentence, I dare say the more you enjoy your island life, the more Nook miles you'll earn. What have we got? The more you enjoy your island life, that's the intrinsic motivation, right? That's the thing that's actually enjoyable. The more Nook miles you earn, that's like the carrot. That's the reward that players they get. If we just have the intrinsic motivation, maybe that's vague. If we're rewarding Nook miles for the wrong thing, that's bad. Players are now rewarded for the wrong thing. So it's interesting. I like seeing stuff like this, like an example of Animal Crossing, actually just like putting it down. So takeaways. Your system should fulfill short, medium, long-term goals. That's kind of true. That's actually quite wrong. It's like it should fulfill at least some of them in a concrete way that you can, communicate and make tangible to your team. But at least you want like all three being fulfilled at some point through some system or systems. A lack of medium-term goals can make long-term goals feel too far away. I think that's true, depending on the scale of your game. And we can use medium-term goals to create tangible steps towards a long-term goal, in the case of like a rank system. Cool. And the last thing is narrative framing. This is really about making your player's life easy, right? Like we said, we have these like complicated systems. It's sometimes fair to assume that the player has like a bunch of knowledge about games, right? They've already played games that are similar, and that's good. But sometimes we have new players, or it's like usually a good goal to try to onboard new players, right? Like increase that funnel. So narrative framing can help by alluding to motivations naturally, right? We're using some sort of narrative framing or like storytelling that is already inherently about that motivation that we're trying to fulfill. It can also help by assisting with goal formation, right, in a sort of a similar way. In this narrative or in this story, typically those stories involve this sort of like long-term goal, and that aligns with the long-term goal that we have in our game, right? So if it's about collection, like Pokemon is like the best example because they somehow managed to find like a narrative or build a narrative over time that's about like battling animals, which has like relatively large skill depth, and collection of the cute animals themselves. And it's like, how'd they do, like, it's so weird, but it only works in Pokemon, and I don't think any other game can do it unless they're like duplicating Pokemon, right? And they're sort of relying on people's knowledge of Pokemon to make that seem like not messed up. We can also make numbers romantic. I love this word romantic. I use it all the time. I like to make things seem romantic. And I don't mean like lovey-dovey, unless that's what you want, but like more evocative and just more interesting, right? Instead of like level 1, level 2, level 3, we can be like, oh, it's more like this. It's a journey, right? And I think that's better. Those are the sorts of games that I like to make. So some examples, really easy. A basic level progression system for a karate adventure. You could use this idea of like colored belts, right? Be culturally sensitive, just by the way, not, maybe do your research. But like, people generally understand what it means to become a black belt, right? So if you tell the player, become a black belt, they're like, cool, I know what that means. You don't have to really explain that much. Or maybe you want to like play with that idea, it's like a black headband, or like it's like a cooler belt, like Kainen Rider or something like that. And just toy with this like this commonly understood idea that we all already have for the most part, and use that and like map it over your level progression. So instead of just like become level 100, you could split like level 90 to 100 as being a black belt. And so people can say, kind of like in the case of Rocket League, it's not just becoming level 100, well, that seems boring. Becoming a black belt, oh, okay, cool. That's just more interesting. And you can tie that into your story and your theming in a way that's nice. We could have a rank system for like a The Bear-esque restaurant game. Just finished watching The Bear Season 2. We could use Michelin stars. It's like something that people know. We can invent our own weird tire company and say for some reason that's the company that grades restaurants all over the world. And we could use that every single time you perform X tasks or perform whatever it is you need to get a new star. We can use this existing idea of Michelin stars and toy with it somehow, right? And just make something similar. But again, it's easy, right? Make it easy for the player to understand what this system's going to be. Or like an influence system in a biker racing game. Maybe a bit more niche. It really depends on your audience, right? Do you expect them to sort of maybe know what Akira is? Is it an Akira-inspired game? Okay, let's use the gang system, right? Like from a game like The Warriors or GTA San Andreas. And it's like an influence system and you're trying to expand, but you've got a battle, and it already makes sense because you're making a biker racing game, and that's something inherent to this idea of bikey gangs. So let's leverage that and let's use that as a metagame system or as progression. So it makes it easy, right? Just make it easy. But you might be wondering, Jack, how do I get inspiration for better narrative framing, right? Where are you getting all these ideas? This is the fun part. Read books, read comics, watch things, see theater, touch grass, play games, play weird games. This is Magic Wand. What the heck? This is the weirdest game. It's just like go out into the world and like absorb it all and then drive that into your systems design. And as it starts, it's like, are we talking about metagame systems still? We are, right? But we can also apply this to general systems design and game design in general. I think maybe my experience has been very focused on inventing like a new system, right? And sometimes with live service, it's been like 5 years. It's like, God, what are we doing? We need more ideas. And so this becomes extra important. But again, I think sometimes like it's easy to assume like blue sky design is so hard, right? Like if you're just starting from a completely clean canvas, it is so difficult to come up with new ideas. So anyway, I think this is where this sort of starts to help. The other thing, this is like an excuse to put a cute photo of me and my friends up. Use your own stories. That's the point of this slide. Also, just a side note, this myth book is a great source of inspiration. Again, be culturally sensitive, but like there are some weird character dynamics going on in like old mythology. But yeah, like bring your own like stories and narrative into the things that you make. Use that to drive like narrative framing for systems, and you'll find sort of all sorts of weird influences as we'll actually get into. A little side, other one, as a resource is like trend reports. So this is one called Death to Stock. And this is more around like commerce, fashion, and things like that. But there's just like really interesting stories. Like I like here they call it product storytelling already, right? And it's like these like weird narratives they use in commerce and fashion to like tell a story that resonates with an audience. And again, in a similar way, as an audience member, it's like, I don't need to know as much about the clothes themselves. It's like, I understand the vibe. Like I sort of align with the vibe and now I'm gonna buy these things. Oversimplification, I'm not a fashion designer. But it makes it easy for them, right? They understand what it is that you're trying to sell them or what sort of experience you're trying to create. Another one, tvtropes.org. I'm saying use tropes, go to the source. This place, there's so much stuff here, not all of it is applicable. You can search by like specific titles. So they have some games and they'll break it down to like every single trope it uses. But even when I was making this talk, right, I came across this trope of like, I can't remember what it was called. It was like giving chocolates as love or something, like giving chocolates for love or something. It's like, here's a box of chocolates, I love you. And this is a trope that comes up like again and again and again in like life and movies and books and things like that. And it's like, oh, okay, well, how could you use that? It's like maybe you've got like a linear dating simulator game, right? And every single time you like unlock a new date, you get like a little chocolate that goes in your chocolate box. And the flavor of the chocolate like aligns with like the flavor of the moment. So, oh, it's like a Florence style game, right? And it's like, oh, you had an argument, that's the chili chocolate. Oh, you cooled down, that's the mint chocolate. Oh, it's like the honeymoon period at the start, that's the caramel chocolate. Whatever, it doesn't matter. The point is we can start to use these tropes, and it's like as a player, probably they're going to know like chocolate giving or boxes of chocolate that has something to do with love, filling it up. Oh, that's cute. I don't know, I like that. That's cute. That's so much more interesting than just like level, right? Just do something more interesting. That's what I'm testing people to do, I guess. There's a good, the point of this slide is also don't convolute things, right? Yeah, we might get to that meeting and I'm like, guys, I've got this great idea for like a box of chocolates thing and it's going to be really good. And it's like a little convoluted, right? It would actually just be a lot more simple if we just had like a level system progression and maybe we can find like a nice in-between. So I think like, yeah, numbers are still good. We don't have to make them fully romantic. But even Rocket League, right? We've got like champion 1 and then 2 and then 3. But they use like champion, like there's like a little bit of narrative frame. It's very light touch, but it's there. It's very sports themed. They've got divisions, right? I think that's unique to Rocket League. So find that balance. Like for example, this badge. That's generally like a gamey thing. I guess that's the other thing. It's like, if you know that your players are going to come from other ranked titles, this idea of like the slowly expanding badge that gets like more detailed to it, use that, right? That's a trope, right? We can use that from other games and trust that the players are going to know what that means. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. This doesn't need to be like a wheel that's like a slightly nicer wheel. I mean, it could be. Rainbow Six Siege has those like little metal badges you get as you rank up. Another interesting middle ground, I've been playing Monster Hunter now. And this applies to all the Monster Hunter games, but they sort of like use numbers as part of the fiction of the world. So it's kind of like, it's like, oh, become Hunter rank 11. It's like in real world, it's like, oh, I'm a junior firefighter, but it's like, you're a firefighter 1, and you could become a firefighter 10. And that was like just a commonly understood and agreed upon thing. We sort of have it in like game design 1, 2, but it's like, let's make that game design 100. You could be a game designer 100. That's going to be awesome. So they sort of do that. They like they actually bake it into the fiction of the world, that narrative framing. And I like this again, become a fully fledged hunter. That's the motivation, right? That's the motivation, the intrinsic motivation put down on paper. Becoming a hunter rank 11 is sort of more the extrinsic part. So here's an example of where I used it. I'm never going to talk about the Sims Mobile Eco Workshop ever again. I'm sick of talking about it. But it's just so good, and it really applies. So this is kind of how I did it. There was like a trend report that got sent around, I think by Maura over there. And there was this thing, the context for this, was we had a lot of like old live event content that like was just sitting there unused, and we couldn't just like keep repeating events because the schedule was getting full. So it's like, what do we do with it? We need to like recycle it. And then meanwhile, we had the Sims 4 Eco Pack coming out. I was like, great, it's kind of about recycling, and we're recycling content, so that's already pretty cool. And I'd been inspired by this idea, so it's like recycling, crafting. Initially, I had this crazy idea of like a mega 3D printer that could just like 3D print anything, and everyone was like, okay, I guess that's kind of like something that people do, but I'm 3D printing like a couch or like a statue of a horse. It got a bit weird. But anyway, I saw this Japanese craft called Boro, B-O-R-O, and it's about like reusing denim and stitching it together. And I was like, okay, that's cool, right? That's like recycling, that's like stitching old things together. And I had this idea of like a crafting system. But it also sort of applies to clothes, and it also applies to like furniture, like repairing furniture. And in The Sims, it's mostly about, it's like Kaz Creator Sim, clothes and things like that. And also BB, Build By, so furniture, chairs, roof pieces, etc. Meanwhile, I was lamenting at the price of houses and looking at like how could I, make a house out of a shipping container. Again, using this idea of like recycling. And so that came into it. And I'd also been to the Docklands Library, and I super recommend you go. It's a beautiful library. But it also struck me as strange because they had like 3D printers and like electrical soldering kits and like all these like crafty things. And I was like, oh, what if it's like a co-op community center where you're crafting and you're repairing, and it's in this like beautiful building that you upgrade from a shipping container to like a library. Like boom, Eco Workshop, right? And players really liked it. It was good. I can say it was good and it worked because players told me it was good and it worked. And I think it's still kicking, so that's cool. Cool, almost there. So, takeaways, use narrative framing to help players form goals easily, right? It's like if you communicate that it's going to be a community co-op and you're starting from a shipping container, they're like, boom, I get it, I can form a goal around that. Find narratives and stories from the real world, tropes and etc. that touch on the motivations you want to satisfy. So we had a crafting system. Is this a theme of recycling? It's like what sort of, what things in the real world can we leverage to make players easily understand that it's a crafting system? Oh, it's about repairing. So it's kind of already about crafting. It's super simple, but like it's easy to get these things wrong. But don't convolute things if you feel like it's not right. This is kind of hard for me to tell without the specific case. But for people at home watching this later or whatever, it doesn't mean make it a box of chocolates. Maybe level 10 is just what works for your game, and that's okay. But I like it when it's a lot more romantic. And if I'm reviewing it, that's what I'll judge it on. It depends. You get it. You get it. Just to recap, because we're pretty much out of time, so motivations, understanding what the player finds fulfilling, goals, communicating tangible actions towards fulfilling those motivations, and providing rewards. Hey, you did it. Hey, that's great. You got some points, whatever. And narrative framing, help the player make sense of it, allude to these motivations and goals using a narrative framing that already contains those motivations and goals. When I talk about this, let's not go over that. Thanks. That's it. Do we have time for questions? 2 minutes. All right, are there any questions? There's a question over here.
Would you say the metagame system should encourage play for your persona of the game, or introduce other people to the game?
So should you try to attract new user personas using a new system?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I again, this depends on the scale of your game, and I think like how much you're trying to achieve with your game. But if you sort of identify, this kind of works into like audience market fit stuff, but like, we're making a game that sort of exists within this place in the market. It typically, like, you know, these games, again, you can use motivations to make this case. These games have these systems, and it works because it identifies these motivations. We are not identifying those motivations, and we need to do so. Maybe you do that as part of another system. Is this cutting out?
Yes.
Was I doing that the whole time?
No.
Oh, thank God. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Great. Any others? No notes? I think we're done. Oh, one more?
Do you have any ways to preventing goals from leading to guaranteed motivations besides just thinking about it?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Do you have any ways of stopping goals from leading to moving motivated to the wrong thing besides just thinking about it real hard?
I think we're going to wrap. Let's talk about that one, because I think I need to understand a little better to answer it well. Otherwise, I'm just going to ramble about something, and I don't know if that's going to help. I think that's it. Thank you so much for your time. Have a good GCAP. We did it. Day 1 over. Woo!